So hello, my name is Mark Hayward. I'm the Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Graduate Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies and a member of the graduate program in Communication and Culture. And I will be the moderator for today's event. And I'm very pleased to welcome Katina Rogers to York University today to speak on the topic of thriving in and beyond the classroom. Before I do so, however, I would like to begin by recognizing the territory on which York University's campuses are located and from which I am speaking to you today. Many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with these territories that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I would ask for those of you that are coming to us from other parts of the world to reflect upon the territories where you find yourself today. And for all of us to reflect upon the territories over which the communications infrastructure that we're using to communicate with each other is situated. I'm very grateful that you've made time today to attend this afternoon's event. These have been a very difficult few months for many of us as we look to balance the many uncertainties and multiple demands that we find ourselves facing day to day. And I know from my own experience, it has often felt difficult to plan for next week. So thinking into the future can sometimes feel like a difficult and even impossible task. So again, I just really wanted to thank you all for coming, and I hope that we can make today's event an engaging discussion. Before we go further, I also wanted to recognize the support that's being given to us by three individuals in particular who are working behind the scenes to make this event a success: Yuko Serrano, Kim McIntyre, and Wesley Moore. And I also wanted to thank, by way of an introduction, our guest today, Katina Rogers, who is co-director of the Futures Initiative and Humanities Alliance at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and director of Programs and Administration for Haystack, the Humanities, Arts, Science, Technology Alliance and Collaboratory, an online network that was established in 2002, but that has been at the forefront of developing innovative forms of research, teaching, and communication that bring together people from across a variety of fields to, as the description of the organization notes, quote, think and make creatively and critically, including about equity, access, privacy, security, and other social dimensions of technology and learning. Our guest today, Dr. Rogers, holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she researches and writes about higher education reform, including scholarly communication practices, professionalization, and career development, public scholarship, and advocacy for fair labor policies. Most recently, she's the author of Putting the Humanities PhD to Work, Thriving in and Beyond the Classroom. This is my copy right here. This was published last year in 2020 by Duke University Press. It really is an excellent book, and it does the impressive work of working across both the broader political, economic, and social context within which graduate education exists, and what we could call the qualitative and affective aspects of what it feels like to navigate the world as one approaches and after graduation. It is both far-ranging, but also incisively concrete in the position and proposals it offers. It makes a clear argument and a really compelling argument for what can be gained by reframing graduate education and how it is perceived by universities, by faculty members and students, as part of a broader claim for the relevance of advanced training in the humanities across all parts of society, all sectors of society. And it also, I think, makes a really compelling argument for what we risk of losing if we don't take up this challenge. So the Faculty of Graduate Studies is very happy that Katina has taken time out of her busy schedule to provide her insights and expertise on career pathways for current and former graduate students. But before I turn it over to Katina, who will give a brief presentation and then move on to an open Q&A, I wanted to make sure that I made clear to all of our participants today that I encourage individuals to submit questions you'd like to ask Katina using the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. So we'll be monitoring the chat, but we're going to ask you to use the Q&A function because it's a little bit easier to use. And this will allow us to easily sort through the questions during the talk, We also have about a handful of pre-submitted questions that some of you have provided. And I hope to get an opportunity to ask many, if not all of these during the question and answer period as well. And finally, you're encouraged to chat with other attendees and provide commentary using the chat function if you'd like. But a reminder, if you do have a specific question that you'd like to have asked, please do use the question and answer function. Finally, we are recording the talk for those who are registered but are not able to attend. Again, something that I think is an increasingly common situation we all face. And for this reason, I won't be using anyone's names when asking questions, nor will the contents of the chat be recorded and preserved. So your names, et cetera, will all remain confidential. So on that note, I turn it over to Katina. Thank you and welcome, and I look forward to your presentation and the discussion today.
Thank you so much, Mark. That's such a generous introduction. And I especially appreciate the way that you talk about the book and the work that I tried to do in bringing together a number of different registers and a number of different threads of conversation that I think are not always talked about in the same context. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to set up some screen sharing here, just a second. Which of course worked 5 minutes ago and now requires a new plugin. That's interesting. All right. Sorry, everybody. Okay, forget that. I'll try it a different way.
I can continue to speak effusively about the book.
There we go. I think I got it this time. So funny, no matter how many times you do a tech check, something always goes a little bit wrong. Okay, there we go. Should be set up now. I also wanted to thank Wes Moore so much for inviting me. I really am so glad to be able to be here with you all today. It's great to be speaking in a context where so many of the things that I'm wanting to talk about and have been trying to bring to the fore are actually already being implemented, and to know that there are structures of support that are in place for students and discussions that are already happening. It's really great. So thank you, Wes and Mark, for making this possible, and thanks to everybody behind the scenes. I also want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today from what's now Brooklyn, on land that is the traditional territory of the Canarsie and Lenape people. I acknowledge the Canarsie and Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land, and also acknowledge and honor their continuing relationship with their territory. Since this is a webinar and I'm not able to see people, I would love it if, as I'm talking, if you could just introduce yourselves in the chat. Let me know who you are and where you're coming from, and maybe what your role is within the institution, just so I have a sense of who I'm talking to. That would be much appreciated. So a little bit more about me. I've been working on graduate education reform for the last 10 years, not only at CUNY, but at other places like the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Scholarly Communication Institute, when it was based at the University of Virginia Scholars Lab, and the Modern Language Association. And I mentioned these particular institutions because I think that I've been able to see both from within academia and kind of around the edges of it, how the different pieces of infrastructure shape the kinds of scholarship, the kinds of career pathways that are available, and the kinds of conversations that we're having about the profession. The role that I'm in now has 3 parts to it, as Mark mentioned. The Futures Initiative, which is based at CUNY, the CUNY Humanities Alliance, which connects graduate education and community college teaching, and Haystack, which is an online network with administrative hubs at CUNY and Dartmouth. So there are many different components to my own work, including a lot of administrative duties, but also mentorship with students, research and writing. I'm teaching again for the first time since graduate school, which has been really wonderful to add that back in. And I also want to mention that there are significant non-academic elements that inform my perspective that I bring with me when I'm speaking to you today, even if they're not visible. Those include things like parenthood. I've got 2 little kids who are not here at the moment, so they won't be running on screen, but certainly affects the way that I approach my work and the ways that I have approached my career decisions. My positionality, I am a white woman within academic administrative spaces where there are many people who look like me. And I know that I carry into these spaces a certain degree of privilege. There are factors like geography, where did I want to live? Where do I live? Where are my networks of support? And there are factors of mental health and wellness. And I mention all of these things because I think too often when we're talking about career trajectories and when we're talking about academic spaces, it's often hard to talk about the other sides of ourselves that really play a significant role in what is possible and what is desirable and what our goals are and where we want to be. So I want to be transparent about those things as well. The things that I'd like to talk about today and the areas of focus in my book are threefold. One is that career diversity is not enough. Really, the starting point of the book and the research that I did for the book did start on questions of career pathways. But it doesn't end there. And what I've been finding over the last several years in researching and writing this book is that one of the reasons that sometimes career initiatives can ring a bit hollow is because they may be held in isolation from other elements of the university, especially the intellectual heart of graduate education. Another important factor for me is that structures both reveal and reinforce values. To me, this is also a problem with prestige, that often there may be a stated mission within an institution, structures that work at counter purposes to that mission, typically grounded in elements of prestige. And three, I want to talk about the possibility of joy and sustainability within graduate programs. But I don't think that you can talk about joy without first acknowledging the systems of power that are currently in place and working to bring about greater justice and equity in those systems. It's really important for me to connect these threads, and that's why I especially appreciated Mark's introduction, because too often I think that these happen in separate conversational spaces. And yet, if institutions are not addressing fundamental concerns like the increasing reliance on adjunct labor or race and gender bias within the academy, then it's really difficult to bring about lasting change in other areas. My book also examines the intersections of these practical and structural matters. And my goal is to really examine the nature, the value, and the structure of graduate education, not only as it is, but how we imagine that it could be, while also providing concrete advice to help students, faculty, and administrators to navigate it. I think that we really need a sustained conversation on this that focuses not only on skills and employability, but on how we got here and how to move forward. I want to really acknowledge where we are right now, temporally as well. It has been a very strange year, a very difficult year. I know that Ontario is in the midst of a COVID resurgence right now. New York has been through various waves of it. There's a lot happening. It is a year where emotions and emotional work have been really at the fore. Care work has been taken on added urgency and time. There have been so many challenges, so much strangeness to the way that time passes, that in some ways it can feel odd to focus on things like graduate education reform when there are, when there's a public health crisis going on. And yet, I think, in fact, that this conversation has taken on a renewed sense of urgency in light of the pandemic, and particularly in light of its disproportionate impact on our already marginalized communities. Colleges and universities have a really critical role to play, and scholars individually have a critical role to play in the social fabric of our communities. But these same institutions have so long been spaces of structural violence to underrepresented groups and to precarious workers. Another reason that I think that this is a really timely conversation to have is that so much is shifting really rapidly within colleges and universities right now. Certainly at CUNY, things are really in a state of upheaval. Things have changed very quickly. Even as we've been in this pandemic for over a year now, upcoming semesters are still quite uncertain. Our budget is very uncertain. And all of these things are sort of in motion at the same time. And I think that While that can be really unsettling, it is also an opportunity to reinvest while also reimagining how these educational structures function. We don't necessarily need to return to the ways that things have always been if those ways were not working well. And so I want to be thinking about the big picture. Why do graduate education and the humanities in particular matter in this context? And I think that now is the time to really redesign the higher education system so that it better serves all students and by extension, the public. As I mentioned, one thing that I want to talk about is structure, institutional structure, and what we can learn from the ways that systems operate. A key step in getting there is to think about how success is defined and who is able to define it. In higher ed, this often means looking at processes like tenure and promotion, how they work, what they measure, how explicit are they even versus how tacit they may be. And when we're thinking about tenure and promotion, this often includes things like, publications, grants, fellowships, and all of these are markers of prestige. It is much less common to see really strong consideration of things like mentorship, student support, service to the profession. Those tend to be regarded less highly than the things that are more typical markers of prestige. And I think that that's a problem. Institutions often talk about the public good, especially public institutions like mine, where I think that both faculty and administrators and students have a genuine commitment to supporting the idea of higher education as a public good. And yet these institutions also tend to operate under a structure that relies on an economy of prestige. So we can't just be looking at the words of a mission statement or even the kinds of programs that an institution is creating. It's not only those words that matter. The structures that are most deeply embedded also reveal and reinforce values, whether those values are explicitly shared in mission statements and public documents, or tacit and visible only through things like budgets or meeting minutes or other internal materials. In other words, graduate education may aspire to be a social good, but often that aspiration runs counter to structures that are built on prestige. And so you end up with these two conflicting value systems. And I think that when you find a point of failure, that's often a moment of conflict between those two systems. I've been thinking about Sarah Ahmed's work, her book on being included, especially in thinking about this topic. She uses the image of a brick wall, literally in her book, has both talks about it and includes an image when thinking about diversity work, so-called diversity work. And in Ahmed's work, this is the moment where, say, a committee has been set up, maybe a document has been produced, and even the fact of that committee existing, that document existing, sort of absolves the institution from doing any further work. And so even the act of progressing towards something that seems like a valuable goal can sometimes result in a blockage point for that goal as well. And so I see this a lot in institutions where there may be a great program idea, great people supporting it. Ideally, it's even resourced within the institution or through grant funding, and yet something doesn't work. Either it works for a time and then it fades, or there's not uptake that really changes the social fabric. And I think that that is often a sign that there is an undercurrent of a different value system that is running at odds with the goals of that program. All of the things that I've mentioned are really, at least in my institutional experiences, they're deeply linked to an environment of austerity, neoliberal tendencies within institutions. And what I would really love to think about is how we can break free of that mindset and instead move towards a framing that emphasizes abundance and joy. And here again, I would turn to what I've seen and experienced as an administrator during COVID. Particularly the ways that people have stepped in to support one another when leadership and social structures have fallen short. And I wonder, what might it look like to design a system that has those values at the core? So joy is where I hope to go from here, both in my own scholarship and in the way I develop and advise others to develop programs. But again, this work requires understanding the systems of power that are in play and knowing when to work within them and when to push against them. All of this, again, is why many efforts toward professional development can ring hollow. It's not nearly enough. Real reform that changes institutional fabrics requires looking not only at the outcomes, not only at the blossoms of the interesting jobs and work that people are doing when they finish their degrees, but also at the roots and stems that really create the systems and the possibilities for graduate education. So I'm really looking forward to plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. I really appreciate the questions that you all submitted in advance, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you all now. And I just want to say thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this with you today.
All right, thank you very much. That was wonderful. I'm just sort of watching the various introductions in the chat. And again, before we sort of start the conversation, I just want to also remind everyone, please do share any questions or even conversation points that you'd like to hear a little bit more about. I'm going to ask, because you raised this a little bit in your discussion. It's a broad question, so take it however in whatever direction you think is best. But I'm interested to think a little bit about, what do you feel, or what is your sense of what has changed in the past 12 months? Because I mean, the publication of your book is very interestingly timed. It sort of appears right at a moment when so much does seem in flux, and obviously you're engaged in it and you're surrounded by it, and so it's hard maybe to get that same perspective that you would have over, say, a decade or decades of research. But what is your sense that, what would be different for you now if you were to sort of follow up on the same points in the context of the last 12 to maybe the next 12 months,
Yeah, we wish it would be over sooner than that. And it is hard to get perspective while still in the midst of it. But I mean, I think that what I have seen most strongly and across many, many different institution types is a shift in priorities and a real clarification and crystallization of what really matters. I think that the best examples that I have seen of institutional work during this time has consisted in a lot of stripping away, of letting things go and saying no, not trying to do things as usual, and focusing on what in fact is essential. I think there's been a lot of introspection in many cases about the purpose of certain programming, the purpose of different structures, and in many cases, a reevaluation of what that might look like going forward. I think, I mean, for my program, I noticed at the beginning of when the pandemic was hitting New York that it was extremely difficult to think in anything more than a 2-week increment. And I think that, that 2-week increment was also tied to like quarantine periods, right? That it just seemed impossible to plan any further than that. And that sense of immediacy and really needing to function and live and plan only within where we are at the moment ended up being quite grounding, I think. So from an administrative perspective, that's what I would say, that a sense of, what can we stop doing? What is the most important what are the most important elements of what we do, and how can we better support students? And then that's the flip side of this, is that I think that, from where I sit, which is a place of health and relative security, job security, those are the lessons that I have taken away. But what I've seen among my students and among many faculty at CUNY is so much more urgency around health, around family support, around job loss and economic need. And I think that is really the challenge that institutions like CUNY and many others are facing now, is how do we collectively as institutions find ways to support students so that, that it's impossible to focus on learning, to focus on education when you're losing your job, when your family is ill, all of these things. So I think those questions of, everything that's happening outside the classroom and how that impacts learning and opportunity, have been really significant. In the US, especially, I think the status of international students has really come to the foreground as well in terms of precarity, and lack of support in many cases. And I don't know what the solutions are from an institutional context, but that has surfaced. I mean, it's the question has been there for far too long, but I think it has risen with new urgency to think about what the responsibilities of our institutions and programs are relative to students with different kinds of precarity, affecting their learning and their outcomes.
Thanks. I want to pick up on I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to dive into the questions you already have asked. And it's something you sort of touched upon, and I'd be interested to hear strategies that you've seen being successful or that you think might have some chance of success around, and you refer to it in your presentation in terms of the very different sense of time. And when you were just talking now, you talked about that there's this sort of sense of urgency in all these different places that are outside of the institution, but also the institution itself sort of produces various kinds of experiences of what's urgent versus what isn't, whether this is about timelines in a degree, whether this is about planning for a future. And it is, I think, in some ways, a question that always comes back from what we hear talking to students as well is, how do we perceive having time enough for professional development in relationship to having time enough to be also a researcher, as well as to be the human that you are for the rest of the day. And so, I'd be interested to hear you talk, not just in the context of COVID, but in the longer arc of things. I mean, time feels like a huge question. In the context of York, just to give you a little, and this may actually not be too different from CUNY, is we're primarily a commuter school, right? That students live flung across the Toronto urban, conglomeration, have lengthy commutes, even if they live in Toronto. It could be an hour and a half, 2 hours by subway to get there. And so time is such a precious commodity, and that has probably been exacerbated by our current situation. So I'm interested to hear you maybe talk a little bit about that, or where you would sit in terms of thinking about that for students, and what we can do collectively or individually.
Yeah, gosh, it's very much the same at CUNY. People have long commutes, and because we have 24 campuses spread across the 5 boroughs, so people may be taking classes at the Graduate Center where I work, and then teaching at the College of Staten Island, which requires like 2 trains and a ferry and a bus to get there. So it's really, there's that pressure on time is significant. And graduate students everywhere, I mean, you're just constantly being asked to do more than there is actually capacity to do. And so I really hear this question of how do we then think about doing more? This often sounds like, okay, we're already doing all of these other things. How do I then add more on top of that? I think that the best answer is to find better ways of integrating what's already happening with the goals that you as a program or you as a person want to incorporate. From a program standpoint or a faculty standpoint, I think one of the kind of lightest lifts that is quite easy to incorporate is to just think about any classes that you might be teaching. Think about what you are asking students for in terms of final projects. Is it, only an academic paper? Is that the standard and expected mode of demonstrating learning? If so, how might you be able to open that up a little bit so that students can think about not only what they want to articulate, but also what is the best form to use to articulate that? And that's really the thing that I think is important to center in this, is like it, not so much to think about like what skills do I need to gain in order to be a competitive candidate in X, Y, or Z field, but rather to think, what would best serve my research and my interests, and then go with that, because it's a more organic desire. It's a more natural way to want to pick up skills. If you have a project that you think, gosh, could just be so great over like in an audio context, and you find that you need to learn I don't know, audio editing. I don't know anything about podcasting or radio, but you find that you need to learn the skills in order to be able to do that. When you have a project that's embedded in, it feels much more natural than thinking, okay, I need to learn Python because everybody's learning Python now. So I think incorporating it into lower stakes scenarios so that people aren't just trying to do something new, say for their dissertation, but maybe working on different kinds of projects along the way. I think that thinking about audience and impact are really important parts of this. Who do you think would be interested in the work that you're doing? And given that, what's the best vehicle to share that information? Maybe an academic paper is the best way to do it. But maybe you want to be thinking about, policy briefs or learning how to write op-eds or something completely different. And so I think, it doesn't change the fact that people are extraordinarily busy and pressed for time and with many, many competing obligations. I think that anybody who's in a position of leadership, the more that we can be saying that the more that we can be letting some things go on behalf of students, letting things fall away, really enabling people to focus on what's most important. I think that is a service that we can do right now. And as a student, trying to have a strong focus on what matters to you, which doesn't necessarily mean having blinders on. It may in fact mean thinking broadly and exploring and being inquisitive about lots of different spaces, but seeing that as a value and not as a distraction. I think in early stages of academic programs in particular, there's so much exploratory work that you don't necessarily know what the long-term impact will be. And just allowing yourself to do that to the degree that you can without seeing it as pulling you away from other things, I think is the ideal. And so the more that faculty and administrators can do to support that, I think the better.
And along those lines, I'd actually like to turn to one of the questions in the Q&A, which is, talking about how the structure of PhD programs or graduate programs more generally can be reformed to allow for a broader range of quote unquote joyful outcomes than the traditional tenured position. And maybe along the lines of what you're talking about is, what kinds of strategies or what kinds of forms of both self, but also advocacy in the communities that graduate students find themselves might be the grounds upon which they can advocate for spaces in which they can pursue something that does produce joy for them, as opposed to feeling, inframed and captured by the system that they're pursuing their degrees in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that a first step is to acknowledge the spaces where this is already happening and the kinds of things that maybe alumni from the institution are doing. I saw a survey a couple of years ago. I can't remember the source now, but it was comparing job satisfaction rates of faculty members and people who had PhDs working outside of faculty positions. And the people working in other positions were much happier by and large than the faculty members. And I think that is worth noting. There's this really persistent sense of constantly having to broach a difficult topic when we're talking about career pathways. And in fact, people have been doing all kinds of things for decades with their careers. And so the first step, I think, is just bringing those to light, really celebrating and thinking about what, again, thinking about values, what are the things that show that an institution celebrates and values the work that someone is doing. It might be something as simple as whose names appear on the website. Last time I checked, which has been a while now, but I definitely did not appear at all on my institution's website where I got a PhD. And I love the work that I'm doing. I'm not a faculty member. I'm an adjunct now, but I've never been in a full-time faculty position. And I would love to talk to people in my program about what I'm doing and what it looks like. So I think the first step is just having greater transparency about what kinds of things people are doing. I think that also helping to develop some translational language to be able to talk about, research, public impact of research, how that connects to the practice of teaching, what's similar about each of those skills. Just working those conversations together so that it doesn't feel so frequently like there's an academic conversation and then something else that's over here. They're really deeply interconnected. And in many ways, I think that teaching is the link between them. So I'd love to see more of an emphasis on the practice of teaching, the value of distilling and articulating really complex knowledge for non-experts, and then using that to step into what else we think is valuable and significant about the work that we do, and why we want to be sharing it with other people.
Yeah, and along those lines, there's actually a question that was submitted before, and it might touch upon this in different ways, and it's about sort of how we can support each other, but also the institution can support students, but how students themselves can begin to think about how to, the language, I'll read the question directly. So how can I market my academic skills effectively, like teaching and research experience outside of the university? And the second question is about what role do universities have in supporting PhD students strategically in this area? But the first question, I think along these lines, I mean, it sounds like you're engaging with what is a significant silence around these questions. Mm-hmm. And this is asking the question in a very direct manner. Mm-hmm. How, what are strategies that work there?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure this is a question you've heard before. So
yeah, no, definitely. And I think that collectively, you know, I'm coming from a literary field. I think collectively we're not very good at maybe explaining the things that we do, or we get accustomed to using a lot of shorthand that we expect to do a certain amount of work. And that shorthand doesn't work in other contexts. So I think that it's really important to first like try and break apart, like almost like denaturalize these parts of what you do for yourself, so that you're not thinking of teaching as like one block, but really trying to disaggregate it into all of the things that you do. So you might, you might propose a course depending on your status within the institution and whether you have that freedom. You might develop a syllabus. What goes into that? What are the norms that you are sort of inheriting within the field? What are the interventions that you're trying to make? You're thinking about who the students are going to be. What knowledge are they coming in with? What are you hoping that they leave with? You're designing assessments. You're doing project management of your own and helping students to do project management, to scope assignments appropriately. And you're doing a lot of, like iterative reflection and articulation and constantly reassessing what is working and what isn't over the course of a semester. And so thinking about like what all of those pieces are. On a CV, you don't have time to articulate all of that, or certainly on a resume. But where you do have a lot of opportunity is in your cover letter. And I think that, or when you're meeting someone, when you're talking to them face to face, I think that the cover letter, or anytime you're meeting someone, it's such an opportunity to engage in an act of translation, where you are not necessarily expecting someone to know or understand why what you're saying should matter to them, but you have a chance to articulate that. In research, I mean, one of the things that I found in the survey work that I did that formed kind of the seed of this book project was that people who had PhDs and who were working in positions other than faculty positions, they tended to really undervalue their research skills as something that mattered in the job that they were in. Whereas when I surveyed their employers, all of the employers said, oh, half the reason I hired this person was for their research skills. So I think that sometimes people in graduate programs or who have recently graduated get caught up on trying to find ways to explain why their subject area matters. And in some cases it does. There's, sometimes for a position, there's a direct connection between what you have studied, what you have researched, and what that organization is doing. But even if there's not, the process that you use of whether it's archival research, interviews, field work, literary analysis, all of this involves, taking in a massive amount of information, discerning the signal from the noise, finding your own way through it, and then articulating that in a different way. And that matters in every single organization I've ever been a part of. I think that it is, being able to do that work. I think that sometimes we forget that it's a skill that not everyone develops. And as a doctoral student or a recent graduate, you can probably do that like breathing. I mean, it's a part of everything that you're engaged with. So bring that and really see that as unique. I guess that's the other thing that I would say, is that many things that feel like sort of a baseline within a graduate program really stand out in other areas, in other sectors, or in other professional spaces. And graduate school is really good at sowing doubt in your own abilities and creating imposter syndrome. And it's hard to overcome that, but really, just, I think the more you can see this work that you're doing as incredibly valuable, in terms of, again, being able to synthesize information, being able to write clearly and compellingly, being able to teach and persuade and argue for something that you care about, all of that really matters.
That's really helpful. It actually answers one of the questions that was posed before this, which is, what skills are non-academic employers interested in? Mm-hmm. But I do want to ask the follow-up question to that question, which asks, for instance, do publications matter? So again, I think maybe it's taking the question and sort of extending it a little bit. Even if non-academic employers may be valuing the skills, what are the kinds of metrics, or how do we begin to think about the ways that they measure one's ability?
Sure. It's a really good question. Oh, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
I think it really depends on the employer and what kinds of work they're looking for. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is no, the publications don't really matter, but that's not entirely true. So I want to give it more nuance than that. I would say that I have almost never talked about my dissertation in depth, probably maybe never. And I've been in like areas that are pretty closely aligned with academic institutions, if not within academic institutions. That's not true for everybody. And I know that some people really want to be able to stay closer to their dissertation work. So I don't say that to, make you feel like, oh, that's, I'm never going to touch this again. But I do think that the things that seem so big as a graduate student, they just, the perspective really shifts in other places. What mattered about my dissertation was the fact that it showed, a ton of diligence. It showed that I could take a long-term project and see it through from scoping it out to completion. It showed commitment and, writing skills. But I haven't engaged with the subject matter after that, not much. At the same time, I think that if you're looking at positions where, something like data analysis is a part of what the bread and butter of the work would be, then yeah, absolutely. Being able to show that your work was not only completed and valued within the institution, but also that within, the spaces that, whether it was at a conference or in a journal, that work was seen from outside and also approved. I think that that's really valuable. However, I don't think that things like, the relative prestige of different journals, that carries very little weight, I would say, except in areas that are highly specialized and still closely related to people's content areas. So the things that, you're striving for, or you may be striving for, if you're pursuing a faculty position, it doesn't mean that those things will not be valuable, but you're going to want to talk about them in a different way because they don't have the same shorthand value. So, I mean, I think that all of these skills can amplify one another. So I don't think that it's a matter of saying, oh, if I'm not going to pursue a faculty career, then I just shouldn't even be bothering with conferences or publications. I don't think that's true, but I think that you do need to go into those other contexts with a clear sense of what you're trying to do. Are you wanting to workshop ideas so that you can hone your own thinking? Are you going into it, conferences in particular, are you going in order to be able to network and hear other fresh ideas? That's a different approach. When you're publishing something, is it something that you are wanting to continue expanding further or not? So I think that if you can find ways to think about professional goals with not only having those outcomes be an end in themselves, but thinking about why those are the things that you're striving for, that'll help you to be able to make the translation in other contexts as well.
And I think that comes back in really helpful ways to the previous question about thinking about how to market these skills in different contexts. I want to go back a little bit to ask another question here, and then there's a whole series of questions that are about more systemic issues. But the question is, I have an MFA in dance, and I want to find a career in another field of work. What is possible? And this is the part I really want to hear about, is where do I start? A lot of these questions, it feels a little bit, and I can imagine it still brings back some sense of this, is what's the first, like, what are the first steps, right?
Yes. I just put a link in the chat because this would be my first step, even if it's called Imagine PhD. It's not only for people who have or who have pursued PhDs, but anyone who has been embedded in academic spaces and wants to think about other possibilities. This was designed by people at the Graduate Career Consortium, which is the professional organization for graduate, like, career centers, that kind of thing. And it is very well done. It includes like a skills and values assessment that I think is just good sort of reflection and self-awareness. And then once you go through that, it groups different types of career paths into broad buckets. And it does it in a way that I think is quite thoughtful. And it's easy to see at a glance, both more concrete possibilities and also what those actually look like. The further you drill down into each of those spaces, the more detail they provide with, like, things like descriptions of what the day-to-day work looks like in a given profession, or job application materials that someone has submitted for that role. I think it's really hard to find those kinds of materials all gathered in one place. So this is where I would start. It's nonprofit. They're not going to do anything with your data, so I like it much more than some other spaces that are a little less scrupulous with user privacy. But I would start there. I would also look into resources that are available at your institution. The thing is that when you're starting to talk about, like, specific and individual career paths, there are so many variables. I think the thing that is most disorienting for many people coming out of academic spaces is that we are often sort of socialized into a sense that there's this one track and this one pipeline, and everything, there's a lot of uncertainty, but there are certain scripts that are in place. We know when jobs are usually posted, what kinds of materials they'll usually expect, when those jobs are then decided. All of that stuff happens according to a relatively fixed timeline. When you're looking at any other field, it's much more open than that. The searches happen more quickly. They happen throughout the year as needs arise. They use all different kinds of terminology to describe what's often like similar types of work. And so it can feel really disorienting, I think, to try and find your footing in that space. The other thing that I tend to recommend is that do something like this, like Imagine PhD, and then start with a broad job advertisement board, like, I don't know, Indeed.com or something like that. LinkedIn is getting better and better with job ads. And don't approach it as though you're looking for a job. Approach it as a researcher who is curious, and think about, like, as you're looking, I think the thing that is really difficult about this exercise is that it is almost impossible to look at job descriptions and not feel an emotional reaction to them, either excitement or anxiety or dislike, because you're automatically projecting yourself into those positions. But if before you do that, if you can dig in and try to notice what are the kinds of things that seem to give you those reactions? Is there a common thread among the positions that start to excite you? Is there, when you see something that catches your eye, do some searching around that. Don't look just for that specific position in other contexts, but look at the keywords that are in the job ad. Maybe there's something in the skills that really appeals to you. Maybe you're noticing that, I don't know, a certain organizational structure or mission appeals to you. If you can start with that broad search with a little bit of detachment, I think that it can surface a lot more possibility for what might be a good fit for you. And then if you're able to pair that with some individual career advising, I think that that's the best way to go. Someone who can sit down and really look at your materials, because there's not, I intentionally did not include like CV and resume guidance in my book. One, because I don't think I'm the best person to give that advice. And two, because it changes all the time and from field to field and from job to job. So really you want someone else to be able to take a look at that with you, and help you to think through, what might be missing, in terms of how you're articulating what you've done, and how best to position your work and yourself for a given role that you're interested in.
On that note, I just would do a quick shout out to Carolyn Steele, who does a lot of career advising for graduate students on campus and is in the meeting today. So just by name at York, if you're looking for somebody who could begin that conversation with you in terms of some of that one-on-one, do reach out to the Career Center. That would be one of those places. And her email is now in the chat. So one of the questions.
And sorry, I just wanted to say, since you're plugging her specifically, the earlier you can do this, the better. I think sometimes it feels like there's a lot riding on these conversations, but there doesn't have to be. Just, you might not know what you're doing. It's okay. I assume this is okay.
Yeah.
I think the earlier in your program that you can start those discussions, the better. And it takes so much pressure off, when you can have the discussions without a ton of urgency riding on them.
Well, and that actually was one of my follow-up questions, which is, sort of the scenarios that you were sketching sounded very much of the kind of thing that is, and this makes a lot of sense, student-led. But one of the conversations that I know from my own experience, and I know from the experience of people around me that can be the most difficult, is a conversation with a faculty member, a supervisor. Mm-hmm. And this comes back a little bit to sort of that conflict that you were talking about between structures of evaluation and prestige. Mm-hmm. And different ways of valuing and recognizing one's self-worth, but also one's ability and expertise. Mm-hmm. In your own experience of working with students and talking with them, but also working and thinking in conjunction with faculty members, what can students do to make that conversation better? What can we as an institution do to make that conversation mm-hmm. feel less like a very difficult silence to break?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I would love for the burden not to be on students to have to find like the way to thread that needle, but I think often, at least right now, they do. I think, so I guess saying that, I would say first that I think there are institutional things that can be done, that can help to normalize a much wider range of conversations. One thing that I think is a really promising practice is having mentorship clusters instead of just one-to-one advisement, and not necessarily around the dissertation specifically, but I think that the more, like the Graduate Center's English program, for instance, is from the entry point of a new graduate student. They are pairing a few graduate students who are at different stages of their studies with a couple faculty members. And having that cluster, I think, automatically normalizes the fact that there are multiple opinions around any given question. And I think that that's one of the things that is really hard to loosen in a one-to-one student and advisor relationship, is that the power dynamic is so unequal, and it almost feels like there's just an iron grip on what is acceptable or not, in the hands of that advisor. Whether the advisor feels that or not is, I think, not even relevant, because the power structure is there. And so the student often feels that risk, that if they express something to their advisor and the advisor disapproves, there are real impacts of that, real repercussions. So from an institutional perspective, I think, finding ways for students to be talking to more people who are in those positions of authority simultaneously, so that they can balance perspectives off of each other, and so that they can hear from people who may have different skill sets and different life experiences, I think is great. From a student perspective, I think that to make the conversation go as smoothly as possible, first, I think it's wise to know who you're talking to. I mean, find out as much as you can from other students or whatever. There's often, there's whisper networks about people who are supportive or not supportive. You want to find that out, because you want to be you want to be cautious, right? You can be in a precarious position in these discussions. And so I think you want to be aware of that. I think that in most cases where students feel anxiety about these discussions, the profile that I would describe of the advisor is someone who is open, but not necessarily informed about what those pathways might look like, and therefore doesn't know how to show support, which a student may then perceive as like a dismissal or a discouragement from pursuing a certain pathway. And so I think that if you are finding yourself in that position, again, I think you want to collect support from other areas where you can, both your peers and from other people around the institution, which may or may not be in your program. It may be people who work in different spaces across the university. But find people who can offer you that kind of support. I think that if you can ask questions of your advisor and try and find out like what the concern is, if you are sensing concern, then that can be helpful. I think there's a lot of assumption that often goes into academic discussions in academic contexts, where the two parties involved may not be communicating super clearly. And so you might think that you're hearing negative feedback. And if that's the case, asking questions about why and what the concern is. If it turns out that concern is, well, I don't know how to support you when you pursue that route, or I don't like, how are you going to connect all this work that you've been doing to this particular goal? That gives you more to go on. Those are two very different kinds of conversations. So then the next piece that I would encourage you to think about, and this is not just for that conversation, but really for your own like research integrity and your own like sense of direction, both within the program and then wherever you may go after, is to think about those questions about like, why is this a route that I want to pursue? What are the connection points that I see? Why did I start being interested in this subject matter in the first place? Why do I think it matters? Those questions, sometimes we get out of touch with those questions the longer we're in a particular program. And it's good to revisit them and, kind of remember what it was that brought you to a particular field in the first place, and think about how you can articulate that to someone outside the field. I think that can be clarifying. But I don't want to gloss over that those conversations are hard. And I think that the feelings that people have around, concern about broaching those topics, I really think that that's on faculty and advisors and administrators to institutionalize and formalize how those conversations happen. I mean, maybe you start with introductory courses that incorporate conversations about public engagement and impact and applications of research, along with professionalization and research methods and that kind of thing. Normalizing it from the outset from a departmental perspective makes it much, much easier for students to be able to ask.
Thank you. That's I've been taking notes frantically. I will have to go back and also watch the recording to make sure I get all this down. There are a couple of questions that we have both in the Q&A and that were asked beforehand that are a little bit more broadly framed and a little bit more far-reaching in sort of how they're articulated. So they don't exactly cover the same territory, but they do all sort of ask some broader questions around how we think about the future of higher education. And the one that was asked before has a lot to do, I'll just ask the question, what 21st century career opportunities are available for master's and doctoral graduates in humanities and social sciences? What areas may not immediately come to mind, but their skill sets suggest that they could thrive in? How, and in a very different way, I think there's this sort of some questions around how do we begin to assess opportunities in the contemporary moment, when it feels like so many things may be changing.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and again, this is an area where I think talking with with Carolyn, for instance, on campus, is a great idea, just because I often struggle to answer this question because it's hard for me to think of an area where a humanities perspective and sense of humanities methodology and mode of questioning would not be useful. I have been thinking about this a lot with regard to COVID and things that I saw in the first weeks, really, of the first surge in New York a year ago. What I was seeing at that point was, things that are very much better understood now, I think, but we were seeing such disproportionate impact and many, many more cases happening in low income and predominantly Black and Brown and immigrant communities. We were seeing much more overcrowding in hospitals happening in those zip codes. And the first questions that people were asking were all epidemiological in nature. Are people of different genetic makeups more susceptible to the virus? Is it, they were asking questions about how it traveled from a scientific perspective. What I was not hearing in those first weeks were the deeper questions about how inequalities layer on top of each other to make it so that people in those communities were not able to stop working in person. They were still having to go into their jobs, and they were facing greater exposure because of that constant back and forth. They might have been living in multi-generational families, which was causing more significant spread. They might not have access to decent healthcare in the area where they live, and so they might have avoided, other types of routine and preventative health. Those kinds of questions, which draw in matters of redlining and housing inequality going back generations in the United States. It brings up questions of educational inequality and how different public schools are funded in the US. Those questions are humanities questions. And I think that those are the questions that really, really matter to me. Obviously the science matters as well, but I think, one of the things I've been really glad to see in the US with the new presidential administration is the appointment of people like Alondra Nelson to high-level science-oriented positions. Dr. Nelson is a sociologist who comes from a very, humanistic and qualitative background within the social sciences. And she's bringing that to an Office of Science and Technology in the White House, which then informs policy. That's what we need. We need people in government. We need people, we need people in tech. I think I hear this example more often, and so I find it less compelling to talk about. But certainly, if we see companies that are pushing forward with artificial intelligence and just all kinds of technological advances, that we get so excited about the technology that companies forget to think about, or it's not in their interest to think about, the unintended consequences that may come after that. Certainly, we need people asking those questions from earlier on, before a product hits consumers in tech environments. Anything policy related. Think tanks and research organizations are definitely a great place to land. I think one of the things that's hard is that lots of industries are under a lot of pressure right now. And so, yes, we need people with humanities grounding in journalism and in publishing, but those fields have been hit so hard as well. There's not one place that I would sort of point people to. But I think that there's almost no place where your skills won't be valuable. They will always bring something to the table, and often something that's really quite unique.
Yeah, and it comes back to, I think, something we were talking about before, about the importance of being able to produce, or not just individually, but as a society, a narrative around the relevance. You use the language of abundance in certain perspectives, but it's about sort of relevance, impact, presence, all sorts of ways. There's a question here that I'm interested to hear your response to, and it's a lengthy one, so I'm going to read it. It's that, so the person's asking, they have a question about how graduate programs can reimagine themselves within neoliberal institutions. So some departments committed to critical research and social justice issues have resisted market-oriented restructuring pressure from administration. While this is an honorable goal, it has precluded proactive responses to changing circumstances. So by continuing with business as usual, they have failed to adequately support its grad students in preparing for the job market, both inside and outside academia. How might grad programs allow change without abandoning this tradition?
This is a great question. And I think something that is underpinning this question is also pointing to a certain discomfort that I felt in the early stages of writing this book, which is that I think that talking about careers and skills and that kind of thing is often used in a neoliberal, within the context of a neoliberal institutional set of institutional goals to try and, either to try and justify graduate programs or to, it does not feel great, right? It's like, it feels like it's trying to, for one thing, fit a square peg in a round hole, to do something that doesn't feel organic to the program. And it feels like it's very connected to capitalism, to the ways that institutions are facing pressure to document the value of what they do. It doesn't feel good. And I have felt very strongly that I did not want my book to play into that same thinking, where it, again, like places the pressure on the student to just figure out new skills, to rebrand yourself, whatever. That's not what I mean. And so I think that part of what can happen within a department is to think about the ways that these questions are connected to the intellectual goals that the department has. And again, like, I think, I don't know, sometimes when we talk about skills, it feels completely disassociated from the intellectual work that we're doing, either in teaching or in research. But if you start from a different place in that line of questioning and think about what do we hope that our research can do in the world, that is a really different starting point, and it will often lead to the same, like a similar set of needs. You may find that, well, if I, as a scholar, want my research to be able to do X, in order to do that, I need to gain skills in, whatever thing to lead me down that road. That feels completely different than saying, well, we need to have a better placement rate among our graduates, and so everybody needs to learn, whatever, CVs to resumes, or you need to learn this programming language, or whatever the case may be. So I think we're in grad school. I went to graduate school with intellectual questions in mind. And I think that if we can let those intellectual questions drive the conversation, then the rest can kind of follow suit with that. Along those same lines, I think thinking about where things like career centers and professional development spaces within the organization, thinking about where they're located physically and also like institutionally, hierarchically, is really significant. Sometimes they're like at the Graduate Center, it's located below the office of the provost, not housed within any academic departments. And I think that that's often the case. But the more removed those spaces are from what the students know matters, which is the voices of their advisors and their faculty members in their department, when the office is physically really far away from that, it's harder to make those connections and to really, I think, convince students and faculty that this is all part of the same mission. So I think that, this is not something that can be easily changed within an institution, but thinking about like, what are the tacit signals that we're sending by where something is institutionally located, where it's housed on campus, how comfortable is that space? Do students feel welcome there? All of those things really matter. Graduate students are trained, especially in the humanities, are trained to read between the lines. And so I think that the more that those questions about really the concrete matters of jobs and careers and skills, the more that can be connected to the intellectual questions, the more deeply it will resonate and the easier that integration will be. I also think that faculty members should talk about the work that they do more, like the nitty gritty things that you do as part of your job that Sometimes people don't know until they're in an assistant professorship, but things like committee work and all of the different pieces that happen in addition to the research and the teaching that people expect, I think normalizes just being able to talk about faculty work as work and to be able to talk about intellectual work as work. I think that that's part of the problem too, is that we often don't see intellectual work as labor. And so bringing that back into the fold as well, that that this is a job, I think can be helpful.
Thanks. I'd also say, I just want to add that that's an uncannily accurate description of where we've placed some of our career and professional sports for students across campus.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
And you've not been to the York campus. I don't know if you've been to the York campus ever.
I haven't.
It's actually it's a very large sort of area with buildings very widely spaced. And in the midst of Canadian winter, transit between buildings can be is actively avoided.
Yeah, you're not going to go over there if it's miserable to get there.
So that's really. There is a question here also about sort of the structure of how we think about academic careers. And the question is, do you think the whole structure of tenure is still relevant and useful, or is it outdated?
That's a big question. I don't know. I think that the premises of tenure are absolutely useful. I think that the premises of shared governance are admirable and important. I think that tenure becomes less and less useful when more and more faculty positions are being shifted to precarious adjunct roles. Because what that ends up doing is, rather than having a sense of collective governance, service work, all of this spread evenly, I don't know that it was ever spread evenly, but at least distributed more widely across faculty members, you end up with, what is it now, 30% of faculty members who are in tenure track positions, at least in the US, 30% of faculty members taking on all of this other work, while 70% of faculty members are not making a living wage and are not, they're not at the table for those conversations. They don't have time to be, they don't have support to be, but their voices are also not heard there. So I think that thinking about tenure has to be considered in conjunction with adjunct labor. If we can find a way collectively to reinvest in faculty positions so that a larger percentage of our faculty are in stable and committed roles within the institution, then yeah, I mean, I think that more than the factor of job security, I really think that those elements of shared governance and service work are really deeply valuable, and that contributes to shared leadership, institution building, all of these things that I think can contribute to the overall health of a university. But when it's siloed to so few people, first of all, the people who are doing that work do not have time to give it their attention. They're overburdened. They're trying to do more with less all the time. And so, then it starts to seem both less valuable because fewer people are a part of it, and also less relevant because the work is not always being done deeply and thoughtfully. It's something that is just one of so many commitments that it's really hard to focus on it. And I think that this is also connected to student support, because in matters around mentorship, not only like dissertation advising, but any kind of informal mentorship that faculty members provide, here too, I mean, this part of the work should really be supported. It should be a part of people's paid jobs. What often ends up happening is that, students may turn to faculty members that they have who are adjuncts, who, they're not paid often to do the kinds of advising and support work. And so it may be something that they feel committed to doing, but they're not being compensated for that work. So I think that it's a question that's embedded in the overall labor structures of faculty work and what we consider to be valuable. And unless we consider student support, committee work, service, all of that stuff to be something that matters, then tenure doesn't seem to be as relevant without that deep connection.
Thank you for that. I missed, there was a follow-up question actually to a question we discussed a little while ago, and this actually may be our last question today, which is, so I'll just read it. So as a flip side to resistance to neoliberal job skills-oriented forces can be a sense that going to work, quote unquote, in the industry, a department is dedicated to critically studying is a form, that the department is dedicated to critically studying is a form of selling out. So going to the dark side. Are there ways to de-escalate this us-them atmosphere in a critical type academic disciplines? I apologize to the person who wrote that question for butchering it in my reading of it. I also sort of want to supplement this by saying if we multiply where we think about success and career pathways, how do you think about the place of the academic who is no longer working in the university, but who continues to contribute to that community? Because it seems like this is another side to this question as we begin to, if we think about this in terms of de-escalation of us, them, but also those who transit across that border in different ways.
Yeah. I think that this sense of like going over to the dark side, I think that that's one of the really prevalent attitudes and one of the reasons that that people may shy away from thinking about those kinds of careers as possibilities. I mean, I think that part of the question is to think about like what might be possible in those spaces with more critical engagement and jobs that really feel like, I mean, you're describing something where like someone might be going to work in a space that has specifically been, a site of critique within a discipline. It's hard to do that and to maintain a sense of your own integrity, your research values, your disciplinary values. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. And it's not for everybody, but those spaces are where we need people with critical voices the most, right? Because those spaces are likely, this is, the conversation around tech in many ways, like those spaces are going to flourish with or without people with critical engagement. And we will all collectively be better off if we have people asking critical questions throughout every stage of whatever that institution's process is. So I think that like bringing a frank acknowledgement to the table that, yeah, this is a problematic institution, or this is an institution that we have talked about in a critical sense. And I want to be working in that space as a way of bringing a critical lens to the work that's being done. It also might burn you out. I mean, you might find that you get there and it just is not possible to engage in the way that you hope to. And the thing that's really great about jobs outside the academy is that they are not forever. You can leave them. And I think that there's, not that you can't leave a job within the academy, but there's a sense of greater agency. And I think that once you make the leap of a first job, it is so much easier to think about where you might go next. Lots of new doors will open up. Where you land first is not where you're going to be forever. And so, it's not, you're not committing to something in perpetuity by trying it out. And you'll meet new people. There's always something to be learned from a position, even if it's not ultimately a place where you want to stay forever.
Yeah, and in terms of the de-escalation, what I find is also sort of de-escalating the notion that it is also a break that is permanent.
Yeah.
That you still,
I didn't answer the other part of your question.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, because it seems like that's such an important thing to recognize that
right.
you don't need to leave the conversation when you leave the institution.
Right. Yeah, completely. And I think there are ways that structures make it hard to continue to be a part of those conversations. I mean, I'm thinking about things like my home professional field is the MLA, and at every MLA there's conversations about how can we bring people with other forms of knowledge, with other professional backgrounds in to talk about X, Y, or Z. And sure, like some people are willing and able to come, but also what do they get out of it? Sometimes there's not necessarily an acknowledgement of like the ways in which those conference spaces, for instance, are really tied to specific academic reward structures. And there's often other ways where someone might want to stay involved in a conversation, but not necessarily in the formal spaces of academic, conferences or journals or whatever. But this is another thing where I think that, the environment that we're in now with everything being online, I think it has opened up some possibilities for more permeable boundaries, for broader conversations to happen more easily and more fluidly, without necessarily needing the institutional space of, a college or university building, a conference space, a place where you can have a room to give a talk. It can happen anywhere. So yeah, I think that this is another area where you can think about it from both sides. I mean, thinking about from the classroom perspective and from the institutional perspective, continuing to bring in people's voices through, the possibility of collaborative projects, if people can be partnering with alums who are working in industry. I think the thing is to think about the reward structures on both sides to make sure that it's of value to everybody who's involved. But there's great partnerships happening now. Thinking about the University of Michigan, for example, where their history program now has something that's almost like a lab course that's partnering with the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. And the Holocaust Memorial Museum has some specific needs around writing different types of materials for things that are in their collection that requires historical background and perspective. And so they're receiving, the service of this work that they need to be done. The students are getting a chance to see, what does it look like to write something that relies on our research, but for a very specific context, for a specific audience, and with specific constraints around it in terms of form and length and everything else. And so I think that those kinds of partnerships can be really valuable. They take time to develop, and that can be hard.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I always think of some of the writing that someone like John Jackson, who is, I think, Dean of the School of Communication at Northwestern now, talks about in terms of the equitable exchange of skills and knowledge, and how that's such an important point. We have come very close to the end of our time together, and I did want to thank in particular you, Katina, for joining us today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you so much. Katina has included a link to her wonderful book in the chat.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't.
No, I would absolutely. I apologize for not doing it beforehand. And so we fully recognize how busy everything is all the time these days, and it's something that we talked about today. And I hope that you found something here of interest, of use, of relevance to wherever your future pursuits are taking you, and whatever and how you're thinking about what is to come in the near and in the distant future. And so thank you all. It's very much appreciated. And should you have anything else you'd like to follow up with, please do be in touch with us at FGS, and we're happy to follow up. All the best again, and I hope you have the great rest of the day. Maybe it looks like the sun is still out there, so go outside.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you again for having me, Mark and Les.